In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And then day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and the first part of day 6 happened, and a bunch of amazing things were created. And then partway through day 6, God said, "And let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let him have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and the livestock and the creeping things and over all the earth." And so God made man. God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And he blessed them, and he said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and take dominion over the birds and the fish and the creeping things and the livestock and over all the earth." And God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was all very good. And as we gather tonight, as we assemble to consider seeking and speaking the truth in love, we're not going to get very far in that pursuit if we don't recognize who we are as we endeavor to undertake this task. So by recognizing our nature as image bearers of God, we will be able to rightly recognize who we are, and therefore be able to recognize truth as we discover it and as we find it. Otherwise, we will seek in vain, and we will speak death instead of life. So we begin where God began, and that's with our image, with our nature, which is in his image. And over the years, over the several thousand years that people have been talking about being made in the image of God, different people have made different lists of what that means, right? It's mentioned in the Bible, but then it's not followed by a bullet-pointed list of, oh, here's what I mean. But he elaborates on it throughout scriptures. And over the course of the generations, different lists have been made. And they'll include characteristics of humanity like we're spiritual beings, right? We have immortal souls. So that's one aspect of being made in the image of God. And there are others. We are moral beings. We are creative beings. We are emotional. We are personal beings. The list varies depending on who you're asking. But one that almost always makes the list is that we are rational beings, that we were created with the capacity to learn and to know and to think. And given this last one, that we are rational beings, I believe that we desire to understand the world around us in such a way that our knowledge of the world, we hope it corresponds with the way the world actually is. And I think this is human-wide, not just Christian-wide. This is a part of humanity, even in the midst of being deceived, right? The scripture speaks of those who are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. But in the midst of that suppression of the truth, the reason everything else gets convoluted is because everyone is looking for this internal consistency. We are rational creatures, and so we want the world to be like we think it is, right? There's somewhat of a disjunct between what's going on in here and everything that's going on out there. And being made rational in the image of God, we want those to correspond. And I believe it's according to our nature, Christian or non-Christian, believer or unbeliever, and that this is actually a point of contact that we have with everyone else on earth, that we continue to share the entirety of what it means to be made in the image of God. And I want to begin tonight with a personal tale of truth-seeking to get things going. And within a year of holy matrimony, I had in my hands a baby, this little bitty human, this small human, and she's sitting in the back now with that hat on. She's not as small anymore. But I had this baby, and all of a sudden, this flesh, this image of God right here in my hands, it raised some questions that up to that point were abstract questions. There were questions that theologians talked about and that I read about in books and that everybody had an opinion on, but up to that point I didn't feel like I needed one. And the question that needed to now be answered was, what is the relationship of this child to me? What is the relationship of this child to God? How does this child relate to the church and to her community? And these were questions that now had to be answered one way or the other. For Hamlet, the question was to be or not to be, and the question for me was to baptize or not to baptize. That was the question. And up until that point, I could just play with it, right? I read people, and it just didn't matter. That was not a moral issue for me. I didn't have a baby to baptize, but now I did. So I had to either baptize or not baptize. I had a dilemma. I had a conundrum, and one way or the other, it needed to be based on a rational, well thought through pursuit of truth through the Word of God. And so I began that venture, and I read and I read and I read. And then eventually I was finding that I wasn't sure what to do with all this information. And thankfully, I had friends. I was in a community of believers. And within this community, I had a pastor, and I was at a Baptist church. And I would go and talk to my pastor, and we had long conversations, and we considered both sides of the issue. He would be willing to undertake thinking about what a consistent Paedo-Baptist view looks like to help me think through it. And I had a friend who was a Presbyterian elder, and I would go sup with him on Sunday nights, and we would think through this. We'd do it the same way. We would feel that tension between these ideas, between these godly Christian men that disagreed. And we needed to resolve the tension. My pastor had it resolved. My Presbyterian elder friend had it resolved, but I hadn't yet. And so they worked with me. And then long story short, over about a year and a half, between a year and a half and 2 years, through a long conversation with several people, that issue became settled. I was able to make a decision in that. And what I found through that study was that that truth-seeking wasn't as easy as perhaps I had taken for granted that it was before, and that deciding what you know for sure and what you still kind of question, even though you still have to make a decision, well, that wasn't so easy either. Well, come to find out that this process that I went through of internal debate, which eventually became external debate, well, I wasn't the first to have gone through that, right? Several people had done that before I had. And they had been doing it for several thousand years, in fact. And what I found was that I had encountered the art of dialectic without knowing what it was, without knowing that there was a name for it or that anybody had ever thought about the form that went with it. So I went through the art of dialectic, many of the classical facets of it, without knowing any of the names of any of the categories, because I share the same image that the men who came up with that form share. And this is the beautiful thing about classical education, is as you learn more and more and more and more, you keep thinking, well, I kind of already knew that. Well, yeah, that's common sense. Everybody knows that. And you keep learning these new things, and yet it all seems like common sense. And I believe that's because it's a very human education. And it didn't matter who was sorting the categories of education. It was a bunch of humans doing it. And so it makes sense with the nature that I bear as well. And so I found out that there was an art to dialectic. And that indeed it was one art out of the 7 liberal arts. And I want to introduce you to the 7 liberal arts tonight through a quote of a reader that's really influenced me. His name is David Hicks. He wrote a book called Norms and Nobility back in the early 80s. And he's got a good summary statement of the 7 liberal arts and of dialectic. So, my best David Hicks. The 7 liberal arts of antiquity included the 4 preliminary studies of arithmetic, geometry, harmonics, and astronomy, followed by the 3 advanced disciplines of grammar, which combined literary history and linguistic study, rhetoric, and dialectic. This curriculum passed through the Romans to the Latin West and formed the basis for the medieval quadrivium and trivium. During the Middle Ages, the trivium was generally taught first. With logic taking the place of dialectic. And this substitution was not accidental. To an age that possessed the truth, the dialectical search for truth was a fruitless and even frivolous, irreverent endeavor. When one knows the truth, one has no need for dialectic. All one needs is logic. Yet, to an age like ours, lacking the confidence, some would say the complacency of the early Christian era, the dialectic holds out a serious method of study imbued with a noble purpose. It is therefore to the art of dialectic that we now turn our attention. Moving a little forward in the text. Socrates identified dialectic as the form of the activity of thinking. The form of the activity of thinking. the mind's habit of challenging thoughts and observations originating in itself or in other minds, and engaging in a desultory dialogue, or a dialogue that didn't know where it was going, a desultory dialogue with those ideas until the tension was resolved. Dialectic, stepping out of David Hicks for a second, dialectic is not only a pursuit of truth, an art and a form for pursuing truth, but dialectic also has the double benefit of continuing to remind you that you have never made it to the end of your journey yet. This is two-sided blessing of dialectic. It helps you discover truth, and it keeps letting you know that you don't know it all yet. And returning to David Hicks as a quote, said that although man can acquire a limited knowledge of discrete parts or a skill in performing specific tasks, his knowledge of himself, of his life's meaning or purpose, is never final or complete. The dialectic always rises up out of the whole to challenge the part. Just when he grows confident of his grip on some part of knowledge, thinking man is challenged that his understanding is inadequate when those thoughts are put in relationship to the whole. Like a climber climbing a mountain, and he reaches the summit, the mountain recedes and the view extends. And so if you're climbing a hill, all you have in front of you is the hill, right? This is a metaphor for dialectic. As you're climbing the hill, that's all you've got. You got the next step, you got the next grip, whatever you're doing. But then you get to the top and you realize that you're on one mountain out of a whole panorama of mountains. And this is dialectic. It's an art that gets you to the top of the mountain. It allows you to see the next step that you need to take. But then when you get to the top, you realize that there's the whole world out there for you to continue to explore and to consider. And so this is the art of dialectic. It helps us discover truth. It helps us understand that we haven't gotten there yet. And so I guess you could say my thesis for tonight is that the study of the Platonic dialogues, which is what we're going to be specifically talking about, and learning the art of dialectic from the one who put a form to the art of dialectic, we find that we can know things, we can learn things, we can acquire truth as we seek it out, but we will also learn that perhaps a final answer isn't as easy as we hoped it would be when we started, because when you get to the top of the hill, there's more. And so this is what Plato teaches us. This is what he uses Socrates to teach us in his dialogues. And so Socrates lived in the 5th century BC in and around Athens, Greece. He was a husband and a father, and he was a soldier in the Peloponnesian War, and he eventually was a martyr for the art of dialectic. He eventually irritated people enough that he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he had to go to court to defend himself, except he decided he wouldn't defend himself. And I think it was 470 out of 500 men convicted him guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens. Sentence, death. We don't need your kind around here. He actually had opportunity to go into exile. It was a long time between his sentencing and his actual death due to a feast that was going on. But he said, why should I go into exile? People are the same everywhere. If I just move to another town, I'm going to irritate the same kind of people there as I irritate here. They're going to put me on trial. I'm going to have to go through all this again, and they're going to try to kill me. I'll just die here. I'm 70. I'm done. So Socrates resolved himself to drink the hemlock, and he drank the hemlock and died in the year 399 BC. But interestingly enough, funny thing, in the midst of dying, he basically immortalized himself in the history of Western philosophy. Now, there couldn't have been a better move. It's almost an Achilles move, right? He immortalized himself there. And so, talking about Socrates, but yet here we are talking about Plato tonight, and the two aren't one and the same, but it's almost like they are. Plato was Socrates' student, but Plato names. But Socrates never wrote anything down. In fact, he wrote some dialogues Plato wrote some dialogues about how Socrates didn't think you should write anything down. So that's kind of an interesting twist on everything. But Plato did write stuff down. He studied under Socrates, and especially after his death, it just really propelled Plato forward to perpetuate the thought, to pass on the thought that he had received from his mentor Socrates. So he wrote dialogues. He wrote according to the way Socrates taught. And he wrote, I believe there's between 26 and 30 that everybody's pretty sure are Platonic. And then there's a few that are apocryphal, sort of like to argue about whether Plato actually wrote them or not. But there are 26 of them. They're question and answer format. They're drama. It looks like you're reading through a play as you go through it. Socrates, Meno, Anytus, slave boy, Socrates, Meno. And then it lists out there what they're saying. And 26 of them question and answer. And typically they focus on a particular question. One particular question is often what each dialogue is about. So one of his famous ones is the Republic. Right? That's a common one you'll hear. And that was a question of what is justice. And for 300 or so pages, it's one of the longer ones, they discussed what is justice. And then the Meno, one that I'm going to be discussing in just a minute, the Meno is the question of can virtue be taught? And it's an odd one because there's no introduction. Right out of the box, Meno says, can virtue be taught? And Socrates is like, whoa, slow down, whoa. And then Brandon's going to be talking about the Gorgias, and the question is, what is rhetoric? And I've read one recently that I just love called the Laches, and the question is, what is courage? And if you want to start somewhere, do a little plug. So to read the Laches, it's 25 pages long in the book I have. It's got one motif. It doesn't bounce all over the place. So it just moves you through one type of dialogue, and it's just intriguing. There's some great metaphors in there. Plato's a poet. Despite of everything he said in the Republic, he is a poet. So over the course of these dialogues, through this question and answer, the pursuit is to define something. Like every one of them was, what is X? What is X? And they're not all focused on that, but most of them are. What is X? And so they discuss Socrates and the person speaking with him. It's often called an interlocutor, the person he's talking to. So if that word slips out tonight, that's what I mean. The person that Socrates is talking to asks for a definition to a particular word. Socrates almost always says, I don't know, you tell me. And so the fellow offers his definition. And so Socrates begins to kind of push back and forth, and there's this tension between what one man says and what another man says in order to see if they can play it out logically, consistently, and arrive at truth, right? This is seeking truth through dialogue. And as I was so thankful in my baptism study to have my friends to push back and forth with me, that's what this is. This is the form of truth discovery, of seeking the truth, is that we are not enough on our own. If you think about a book that you read, you're interacting with somebody, sort of. He's teaching you stuff or she's teaching you stuff, but there's no back and forth. And so this is the art of dialectic, is it's going to be back and forth. And this is what Plato gives us in the dialogues. And so in the Meno, right out of the box, the question is, can virtue be taught? Socrates says, I don't know. I don't know what virtue is. And I don't think I've ever even met anybody that knows what virtue is. And Meno's like, you've met Gorgias. Gorgias knows what virtue is, and he told me, and I'll tell you. I know what virtue is. And so he starts to describe this virtuous guy. And this virtuous guy to Meno is a pretty wealthy, well-educated, aristocratic politician in Athens. That's the virtuous guy. And so Meno starts describing this virtuous guy, all these characteristics of this particular type of person. And after he goes on for a while, Socrates says, well, yeah, that works for him. What about a woman? What are the virtues of a woman? And Meno says, women have their own virtues. And Socrates says, oh, okay. What about children? I mean, they don't govern anybody. They don't even govern themselves. What's the virtue of a child? How does this fit? Meno's like, kids have their own virtues. What about a slave, Meno? What about a slave? They don't govern anybody. Slaves have their own virtues. And excuse me. And Socrates says, I've asked you for virtue, and you've given me all these virtues. He said, I've asked you for what virtue is, and you've given me a whole swarm of virtues. Speaking of swarms, what is it that makes a bee a bee? And Meno's like, what? This is a paraphrase, this is a modern translation. What? And Socrates says, okay, so all these bees, you see bee when you recognize it, right? Yeah? okay, so what is it that makes a bee that all these bees have in common, but then that distinguishes a bee from everything else that's not a bee, right? So you've got a general category and you've got all the specifics, and they've got to fit together. All the bees need to have the same thing in common without having anything overlapping with everything else that's not a bee. And Meno's like, yeah, that exists. That's cool. I agree with that. And he didn't really know where to go with it much further than that. So they get to practicing defining things, and they define a shape. Meno's like, can we define a shape? And Socrates is like, sure, let's define shape. So they talk about that for a while. And they say, what about color? And Socrates is like, you're crazy, Meno, just leave me alone. We're talking about virtue, and you want to know what a color is. And so they define color, and actually Socrates gives him several examples, or a couple examples, of different ways to define color. And Meno likes this really fancy one with these fancy words, and it's hard to even know what the definition means because it doesn't sound like it means color. But that's the one that Meno likes. And to pause for a second, when we're looking at Plato's dialogues, so much more is important than the words, than the ideas that are trying to be conveyed by the words, as if it's all definition. Right? We're talking about definition, but this is a drama in a sense. And so the person being interacted with Socrates is a person, and they have a personality. So Plato uses the different questions and the different type of answers to show you different types of people. And we're not going to get to many other people tonight besides Meno, but in all the dialogues, often you'll find this type of person sort of at this end of the spectrum. And there's another character over at this end of the spectrum. And so you're able to think about ways different types of people would answer the same question because of the personality that Plato gives them in the dialogue. And so Meno has this personality of Gorgias told me exactly what I'm supposed to know, and now I know it. So now I can go around teaching other people about it. And Gorgias was a fancy guy. He liked the fancy words too. He was one of the lead sophists. He was one of the lead bad guys in all the Socrates stories, one of the bad guys. And so Meno is one of Gorgias' disciples. And so he's trying his best to be Gorgias. And it comes out in the way he answers questions. He's like this fancy one. I think in the English, the definition for color had the word effluence in it, or effluviance or something. I don't know what that means. But that's the one that Meno liked. So after talking about definitions for a little while longer, they get back to can virtue be taught, and the question of teaching comes up. And so Socrates asserts that when a human is taught, that really what he's doing is he's remembering something he already knew. Socrates or Plato, they're playing with this idea of what does it mean to be taught? We're defining things, right? What does it look like for a human being to learn something new? And so a proposition, a speculation about how that might have worked, is that since the human soul is immortal, which is asserted in the dialogue, they both assert it's like, human soul is immortal, right? Yeah, okay, we agree on that. So that means it's been around the block a few times, because when the body dies, it doesn't die. And so somehow it must get back into a body. So somehow there's, in the Platonic dialogues, it's called the transmigration of souls. It's like a term that Meno would have liked. What does that mean? But in our everyday, we call it reincarnation. So there's this idea asserted of reincarnation, that you live and then you make it back around again. And so Socrates is saying, well, that's how you learn, is that you already know it when you're here at this life. And so you're just remembering it. And all that a teacher really does is stir up some memory that you've already had of something that you've already learned. They don't do the ad absurdum where you learn it the first time. They never go through like where you actually learn it the first time, but they don't get into that, so we won't worry about that. But so they're talking about teaching, and Socrates goes on a little bit about this. He called it recollection, not reincarnation. The idea is that you're recollecting something that you've learned before. So Meno says, show me. Teach me something. And Socrates is like, you dirty scoundrel. I just told you nobody teaches, and you're trying to catch me in a trap. And Meno says, no, I didn't. That's just the way I talk about it. Don't get so antsy. I want you to show me this recollection that you're talking about. So Socrates says, okay. And he looks around the room and he says, you got a bunch of servants here. Let me borrow one of your servants. And Meno's like, okay, pick one. And he comes up and says, do you speak Greek, boy? And yeah, he speaks Greek. He's in my household. It's almost like Meno's offended. Well, of course he speaks Greek. He's in my household. He would speak Greek. So Meno's always on the defensive. It really comes across. So we got this slave boy. And Socrates is going to teach him geometry, or a principle from geometry, without giving him any new information, so to speak. He's going to ask him questions. And I'm going to give you the modern translation of this part of the dialogue. And so I wish I could do it verbatim, because the words matter. The words that he decides to say here and here, I think, are all on purpose. But I don't have it memorized. So I'm going to give you the new Marc paraphrase. It's like the Message version of Plato. And so the slave boy, Socrates asks the slave boy, he says, we basically know what a square is, right? That's a question, sort of. This goes on for a while. We know what a square is, right? And the slave boy says, yes, we know what a square is. And so it's a figure with 4 sides, and the sides are all equal, right? And the slave boy says, yes, indeed, Socrates. He says, and if we were to draw lines like this through the center of this square, those lines would be equal. Yes, indeed, Socrates, that is true, or something like that. And then if we could have this square, it's all equal, then we could have one larger, right? Or we could have one smaller. Would that be the case? And Meno says, I'm sorry, not Meno. And the slave boy says, yes, Socrates. Good, slave boy. You got that. All right, so let's say that we have this figure, and it's 2 on each side. Whoa, hold up, wait a minute. Let's start here. Let's say that we have this figure, and it's 2 on this side and 1 on this side. What would be contained inside the figure? It would be 1 twice, would it not? Yes, Socrates. So if this is 1 twice, and then we double it, then what do we have? We have 2 twice. Yes, indeed. So the slave boy does answer some questions. He does calculate. He does do internal calculations, but it's not as frequently as Socrates asks a leading question. So he says it's 2 twice. And what would 2 twice be? And the slave boy gives the correct answer of 4. He says, good. Now, what would the double of this figure be? A square that contains 4. What would the double of that be? Well, twice that size would be 8, Socrates. I'll make it kind of look like a square. Would be 8. Yes, that's right. It would be 8. And the slave boy does the calculation on that too. He doubles that square there. And Socrates says, okay, so if we started here with 1 twice, and we got 2, and then we doubled it, and we got to 4, doubled the length of this side and got to 4, and we double the area, I don't use the word area, but we double the area and get to 8, what would the length of this side be? And so now Socrates has presented the question. This is the question that the slave boy is going to answer just by Socrates asking him questions. Okay, so this is the task. The task is now before you. And he says, let's figure out what that side would be. And so if this is double that, slave boy, what would this line be? And the slave boy says, well, it would be double. And Socrates makes sure he knows what he's doing, and he says, you sure? And the slave boy is like, yes, it would be double, because this is double that, and so that would be double that. And so Plato says, okay. Socrates says, okay, so let's go back to our original square. And this is the 2 by 2. This is our 4-foot square. And then if we're going to double the length of this line, then it's going to be that long again, right? And if we double the length of that line, it'll be that long again, right? Yes, Socrates. And then if we were to square those off so that we had squares, and now we have 4 here and 4 here. We don't have a square figure yet, so we need to finish that off. And so we would figure that, and we would have 4 there. So we've doubled the length of this side, because we started out with 2, and now we have 4, thinking that it was going to produce the double of the area inside. That was what the slave boy thought at first. And he says, how many of the original squares do we have, slave boy? And he says, well, 4. And he said, well, what is 4 times 4? And the slave boy does the calculation, and he says, 16, Socrates. He said, 16? What number were we shooting for? He said, 8. So how much would we exceeded it by? Twice. We've doubled what we were hoping to get. And so apparently that's not the correct answer. The slave boy was like, apparently not. He says, so if we've doubled, if we're twice as high as we were hoping to be, then if we were to have half of this, we would have it, right? So there's a 2 by 4. there's our 8, right? Well, yes, Socrates, but what's the problem? Well, we were looking for a square. We were looking for twice the square that had 8, not just finding 8. So what are we going to do, slave boy? If a 4-foot square is too much, that's too long, that side's too long, and a 2-foot square is too small, right, because it was just 4, and this is 16, if 2 doesn't work, and if 4 doesn't work, what's our number, slave boy? He says, 3! We're thinking in whole numbers. And so Socrates says, all right, 3. 3, okay, well, let's look at that. So if we've got, we'll just draw another square. So if we've got our original 2x2 4-foot square, this is 2, and so 3 is going to be half again, right? Because that'll be 3. And then half again here, and that'll be 3. And if we finish out this square, then we end up with 3 by 3. Slave boy, what's 3 times 3? The slave boy says 9. And what were we looking for? 8. He says, so what's the number? 2's too small. 3's too big. 4's way too big. What's the number? And the slave boy says, I don't know. Which is huge in a Platonic dialogue. Typically, the only person saying, I don't know, is Socrates. Everybody else is saying, I know. I've got this down. Just listen, Socrates. But the slave boy, I don't know if he's the only character in all of the dialogues, but I know it's not very many, if there's even more than him, that actually Socrates leads to a point where he says, I don't know. I don't have the answer to your question, Socrates. So it's pivotal that the slave boy reached this point. And so now Socrates takes it back up again. He's like, okay, good. We know that it's not 9. Let's look at this again. And he says, I'm going to skip a couple parts for the sake of time. But eventually he says, we've got our big old 16-foot square. Right, and it's divided into 4s, and those have been divided into 2s the whole time, or actually into 1s. So this is 4 by 4. He says, you can draw a line right through here. And if this is 2 and this is 2, right, in this box, then what's the total? 4, okay? So if we take 4 and we've divided that box in half, how much is on either side of that line? And the slave boy says 2. And he's like, good, slave boy. So on either side of that line, just are 2 parts, right? 2 equal parts. And Socrates says, well, what if we were to do that all the way around? I'm going to show how bad my original squares are. There we go. And so we'll have 2 here and 2 here, right? On either side. That triangle's going to be 2, and we have 2 here, and we have 2 here, and 2 here, and 2 here. So how much, now if you're looking at this larger square, how much is contained inside that square? And the slave boy says, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, 8. 8 is included inside of that square. And Socrates says, what number were we looking for originally when we doubled our 4-foot square? The slave boy was like, 8. And so Socrates asks him, so what is the length of the side of a square that's double our original square that contained 4? And the answer in the dialogue is literally this. Which line? What's the length of that line? That. That is the length of the line that contains 8 square feet. After this point in the dialogue, there are no more numbers. That's the end of this point in the dialogue, but yet it's one of the few examples, if not the only, where you actually reach conclusion, where Socrates brings the student all the way through to conclusion. But at the end of that entire thing, the answer to the question at hand is that one. And I think this is not accidental in Platonic studies. And so we're talking about seeking, what's my topic? Seeking the truth in love. So as we look at the Platonic dialogues being tools for us to use to learn how to seek the truth in love, this is huge, that the answer to the question is that one. Because all of these guys that don't ever get to that point, all these guys that are always combative with Socrates in the dialogues, they're always wanting to nail down the definition to a point of certainty that is typically more rational than experiential. It goes both ways sometimes, but they're really looking for that finely tuned, honed definition that answers it conclusively. No more questions. End of game, end of story. And they never, ever get there. And what Socrates is driving them to do, what Plato is prompting us to do through this pursuit, like I mentioned at the beginning, is that we have a capacity to think and to learn and to know, and we have limitations on our abilities to think and to learn and to know. Now it's tainted by sin, but even before the fall, we had limited capabilities, right? A limited capacity to know. It's not being God comes naturally to us. We are finite. We are limited. And so at the end of some of our deepest digging for truth, we're going to find out that the answer is that one. We're not necessarily going to find out that we have the length of the line. We're going to recognize truth as we see it. And God gave us a conscience, and He's filled us with the Spirit now, and not to mention the rational human nature He gave us. But we're going to recognize truth when we see it. But the answer isn't always going to end all the questions, right? So you're climbing that mountain. You're going to see a truth. It's right there. You have the capacity to know, and then you take the next step, and you've got the whole panorama in front of you. So dialectic will help you learn, and dialectic will help you realize that you don't know it all yet. And a funny thing about this is that, let's say we carry this just a step further mathematically than they do, all right? So Pythagoras had already lived, right? So they had the Pythagorean theorem. They were doing geometry for a while now. So they had this, right? C squared is A squared plus B squared. So if this is our C, and this is A, and this is B, then we have C squared equals 2 squared plus 2 squared. C squared equals 4 plus 4. C squared equals 8. You got to take the square root of both sides to get rid of that little exponent right there. And C equals the square root of 8. So now, in all of our brilliance, mathematically, we have arrived at the length of this line, and the length of that line is the square root of 8. What type of number, if you tried to simplify that into a decimal, what type of number is that? You have whole numbers, counting numbers, integers, rational numbers, and irrational numbers. And the square root of 8 is the song that never ends. It just goes on and on, my friends. So the answer to the square root of 8 is whatever number, whatever number by whatever number by whatever it is. I didn't look it up. And then you have to do that at the end because it doesn't end. So even if we go through all of our math to the extent that we're able to understand, we end up with a decimal place that has no end. No matter how far you keep going, it's not a rational number. It will not conclude. It will not repeat. So even if you carry the math out, what do we find? We find that we don't know it all. We find that all the answers aren't there for us to find. And I think that this is the takeaway, one of the big takeaways from studying Plato's dialogues, is that you can learn truth and you're finite. You won't learn it all. And so as you go through the dialogues, the ones we discussed, like what is Laches is what is courage, and this is what is virtue. Meno is what is virtue. And what I believe you find by reading the dialogues is that the virtuous thing to do in the Meno dialogue is to recognize that you can learn truth and that you'll never learn it all. And in the Laches, what's the courageous thing to do? It's a study on courage. What's the courageous thing to do? It's to recognize that you can learn truth and that you'll never know it all. And I believe that all the way through that this is Plato's prime project, Plato's prime philosophical project, P times 4. This is the project, is to lead us in the art of dialectic and to reveal to us when we think we've gotten to the end that we're not to the end yet. And I believe that this will help us love our neighbor as ourselves when we enter into dialectic with them, whether it's evangelism and it's an unbeliever that's pushing back against you with crazy philosophical or psychological stuff, or evolution that you don't understand, that you can sit down and you can be patient and you can ask questions and you can learn. You don't have to prejudge their eternal state because you don't know it all yet either. And that probably what they need is somebody that will consider what they're about to say seriously. And you can do that. You can do that without reading Plato. But I think that reading Plato helps you do that. And you may be with a Christian brother that disagrees with you on a doctrine. And then especially here, right, you can help him seek the truth and love. You can love your neighbor as yourself because you know that acquiring truth is hard. And then at the end of it, you know that the truth I have acquired is limited. So who am I to tell this guy everything he's supposed to believe at this point in his life so that he can become just like me, limited, finite? He already is that, right? But I think another thing that we have to share is that there's a satisfaction that we can come to in the art of dialectic. And that's something that we can share with our neighbor too, whether Christian or non-Christian, is that this pursuit of truth is according to their nature. And as you do it, and as you reach the conclusion of it, it's satisfying. You're satisfied by living according to your nature. And we can love our neighbor by assisting them in that pursuit. So that is seeking the truth in love.